We are now live, so hello and welcome to those of you joining us just a few minutes early. My name is Charlotte. I'll be your money show host for this session. I do have Allison here with me in the Zoom room, and she is ready to begin her presentation on time at 11:50 a.m. That's Eastern Time, coming up again in just a few short minutes. Thank you all so much for your patience, and I hope you're enjoying the show so far. Welcome in, everyone. Hello to those of you just joining us. This is your money show host speaking. The next session will begin on time in just a couple of minutes now at 11:50 a.m. Eastern Time. Thank you so much for your patience. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session. It is my pleasure to introduce Allison Federka. She's the co-founder and principal of Alonia Group, a geoeconomic risk consulting firm that focuses on critical minerals, supply chain integrity, and energy transformation. Now, to our live viewers, please share any questions that you may have for Allison throughout this session in the live chat box. It is located on your platform on the right side of your browser next to the video player there. We will do our best, time permitting, to get to any of those questions at the end of the session. And with that all said, Alison, I will hand the mic over to you. I will be here if you need me, but the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and thank you everyone for taking some time out of your day to join us here. I'm very excited because I love geopolitics. So with that, I will say that this panel might be a little bit different from some of the other panels that you've been able to enjoy today and yesterday, in that the focus is geopolitical. It is going to have some elements of economics and things like that, but it will not get into the nitty-gritty detail of finances, um, or any type of charts, if you will, that you might have seen in some of the other ones that get down into the details of the matter. The goal of this panel is to basically try to share with you guys a new way to think about how the US behaves, and also just a new way of thinking in general about how countries behave, so that it can give you a little bit more insight and predictability to their actions, their policies, and other things that might impact markets that you're following or that you might be interested in. And the reason we chose the US for this particular topic is because it's just the best example we can give, with this idea of how every country has constraints, and that kind of helps shape their behavior to make it a little bit more predictable, and also a little bit easier to follow what might happen next, or how bad could things get, or good, but lately it's kind of been bad. The US is often seen as a very formidable force in the global system. And especially, I would say, starting in 2000, up until about 2020, militarily, it was the best example. Economically, also, the US economy has been dominating the global system for decades. China, of course, had its role, but it's still not quite the same as the United States. And so when this happens, and it's been going on for so long, there is a propensity to think that the US could potentially be unstoppable, or that it's really hard to get in the way so that the US doesn't do just whatever it wants whenever it wants. But the point of all of this is to say every country, every person has an Achilles heel. And that Achilles heel is applicable to the United States, just as it is applicable to any other country. And sometimes when we look at geopolitics or geoeconomics, uh, what we see happen is valuable, but sometimes what doesn't happen is equally as valuable. The difference is we can't see what doesn't happen or what doesn't get done. And oftentimes, constraints are things that cause actions not to occur. Sometimes they shape the action differently, but it's sometimes difficult or a challenge to think about constraints on a country because you may not see them as clearly as the overt actions that an actor might take in the geopolitical system. So, at the risk of stating the obvious, but to try to put us on the same page of what we mean by a constraint, uh, we're still first going to lay some groundwork for why the US is different from the rest of the world in terms of how we understand constraints and how it behaves, and why it's such a good example for constraints. Uh, if you look at the two maps, I picked them purposely because if you look at the top map, it centers the world around the United States. And you can see that geographically, it is actually fairly isolated. It has oceans on either side, it has the Caribbean on the south. And so, people sometimes hear about this idea of the US being isolationist and thinking of it as a foreign policy. And while that is true, there's also a geographic reality to things that makes the US very different from the rest of the world. That we have Canada, that is a great ally of the United States, and so that border is fairly secure and not a problem. There is Mexico, but that border, while it has security problems, it is not nearly as volatile or problematic as other borders, such as, say, Russia-Ukraine border or Lebanon-Israel border. So when you look at it relative to the rest of the world, it's a fairly decent, secure border that's not causing major conflict that disrupts the entire country. Contrast that map to the one below, and you can see Africa, Europe, Asia, and how compact everything is within those land masses and how close together they are. You can also see some of that green space that indicates fairly flat geography, where it's very easy for actors to move back and forth on the land. So this creates a different reality for much of the rest of the world in that they have a much higher propensity to experience conflict directly in their own backyard or on their doorstep. And that is going to change then how the US versus other countries in the world experience or feel the impact of different actions. So, a difference, for example, would be think about World War II and post World War II. The US got heavily involved in World War II. It greatly shaped the US economy. It greatly shaped US foreign policy. The same is true for France, Germany, Italy, UK, Russia, all of the major actors. The difference is that when that war ended, the impact felt by the US versus the impact felt by Europe was very different. The US had all of its infrastructure intact. It did not have to worry about rebuilding any infrastructure to the scale that Europe did. Europe needed that Marshall Plan to basically reconstruct an entire continent. So again, this idea of how different conflicts take place in the world is very different because very rarely do you see a conflict of scale within the United States. And that is because of its isolation, geographically speaking, that gives it a leg up. There's also the fact that it's big and has tons of natural resources of its own, so it is more self-sufficient than most other countries in the world. Uh, that is also why we're picking the US because while it is very robust, it does have its limitations. Um, when we talk about constraints, the value that we have from them is that they eliminate the impossible. And so once you eliminate the impossible, you get the possible, no matter how improbable. So when we think about how the world works or how a country is going to behave, we can come up with a list of scenarios. But if you look at what a country needs and what a country can do, and what a country can't do, then you suddenly start to whittle down the list of potential actions that could be taken to again see what is possible. One example that is good for this is this idea of the fall of the Soviet Union. And no one expected that to happen. In hindsight, everyone can say, oh, it's obvious the system was unsustainable. There was a lot of ethnic tension, a lot of political issues. But at the time, it was hard for people to take that step back and say, let's look at the facts that we have. Let's see, could this continue? And even though it seemed, if you looked at it, like it's hard to imagine how this could continue, the idea of the Soviet Union falling seemed even more unfathomable, even though that's actually what happened. And even though that was completely probable at the time, without properly thinking of constraints and what you can or can't be done, you get different realities and different scenarios that maybe you should be considering that you are not. So that's basically where we're going here. Constraints, what you want, what you need, what you can do. None of those are the same thing. Sometimes they align. The US is special in that it is acting more on that want end of things, while most countries are still working on can we get our basic needs met? But again, this is why the US is an interesting country to look at because even though it is more advanced in what it can do and what it wants to do, it's still going to face some forces that will be pulling it back compared to other actors in the world. When we are talking about constraints, I think it's also important to talk about the current broad picture of the geoeconomic system, which I would characterize it as a moment of recalibration. We have been recalibrating the global economy arguably since 2020. There have been multiple global events that just keep things shifting over and over again, starting with the pandemic, things like Russia invading Ukraine and disrupting energy supplies, you name it. But there have been multiple global events that have dramatically impacted markets and shifted supply chains, shifted alliances, and everybody is recalibrating. So when we look at the US, one of the ways we've seen a major recalibration is with its trade partners and the trade wars and its approach to trade in general. And the interesting thing about that is that hasn't necessarily changed. But if you look at that environment, the constraints that are coming out are impacting the way the US government is behaving. And all of those items that have an asterisk against it are different types of constraints that I wanted to highlight. So when we think about the trade wars, if you can remember back to like January through March of 2025, it was the Wild West. Everybody and their brother was getting some sort of tariff slapped on them. 10% was, the minimum. Some were going as high as 50%. It seemed like things were out of control. And every time there was a challenge or a pushback, more tariffs got put on. Uh, that was followed by a slew of negotiations and different types of deals that were struck. Some of those are still being struck as we speak. And more importantly, you can see over the time that some of these trade barriers and tariffs have been loosened or lessened over time. So that is an example too of how the US is responding to the market forces, demands of other partners, because they can live with constraints on trading partners. They can't live without any trading partners. So there is a limit to how much the US can push back on different countries. How much they push back depends on, the country size and how critical it is to the US market. But in general, you can't just write a blank check for everything. And we've seen that, for example, with the copper tariffs, those have been scaled back. Some of the steel and aluminum have been opened up for other countries. And what are some of the forces kind of shaping this? One of it is the political scene in the United States, where we have midterms coming up. There's a huge social division in the United States, and the US economy is not as robust or performing as strongly as most people would like. And so the government needs to step more cautiously. It doesn't have the political capital or wiggle room that it would need to be able to do whatever it wants anymore. It really needs to be much more calculated. And then, depending on the results of those midterm elections, you will either see a release of political constraints because the legislative and executive branch align, or you will see more of an increase in terms of a governance stalemate or conflict, gridlock, perhaps a better word, between the legislative and executive branches. So which way that goes in the future is going to depend on those elections. But right now it is clearly calming down and slowing down the types of actions that the US government is taking in certain areas. Obviously, we'll get to Iran, but that is a whole other beast to tackle. The other thing to keep in mind is that the critical infrastructure needs of the country have become increasingly apparent. And we're talking about basic old school things like water supply and highways, but also a really new focus on energy generation, particularly as it relates to AI demand and needs, and then also cybersecurity and things related to the digital world. This is an interesting topic because no matter who is going to be in charge in the government pre or post elections, critical infrastructure needs is now a question of national interest. It has always been of national interest, but it is now at the front and center of what the US needs to deal with today. And so you are going to see everybody address that, no matter what party they belong to. And you're also going to see that there's probably going to be some level of bipartisan work in that area and space just because it is one of the few points of agreement or one of the few places to identify that really needs attention and really needs to be dealt with in an efficient manner. The other thing that we're seeing with some of the constraints on the US economy side, I'm looking more at a recent snapshot of the US economy, although you could go back other years to get a different perspective. But we have seen pressures over the years shifting about the economy not performing the way that most of the general public would like, having issues with inflation and things like that. The Iran invasion, or I shouldn't say invasion, but the Strait of Hormuz conflict, the bombings between the US and Iran and Israel, and all of the chaos that is going on in the Middle East, We have seen that impact in markets. We have seen that impact on oil prices. At the same time, it has not really tanked the US economy as much as it potentially could have. Um, and again, this goes back to the idea of the US having a bit more of a buffer compared to the rest of the world. Uh, Two main reasons that I want to highlight is one of US actions that they did that kind of helped create this buffer. One is over the past few years, they've increased their own oil and gas production. So, in terms of energy produced in the US, there is much more supply than there have been in years past for the domestic market. And then, two, Venezuela. So the US hasn't fully brought on, it's going to take years to get all of Venezuela's oil back online and funnel some of that to the United States. But they clearly made a backup plan and a backup oil producer as part of their strategy before taking any action against Iran. So that was one thing that the US did. The other thing that is helping the US right now is that they have fairly secure food production. And while there might be some food inflation compared to other parts of the world, it is not nearly as steep. And the reason for this is one, huge amounts of agricultural land available. And two, the US does make a lot of its own fertilizer. There is some upward pressure because of natural gas on the nitrogen-based fertilizers. But on a whole, they rely very little on imports. And so we're going to get into the nitty-gritty details here a little bit, but this is also an example of why details can matter in geopolitics. And so as you start to whittle your way and see different scenarios and factors, being able to look at the details will also help give shape as to what you can expect that's possible and what is impossible. So while most countries in the world have fertilizer issues in terms of upward pressure on fertilizer prices or supply concerns because it's just not getting there, uh, you can look at the US, and as you can see on the graphic, there's three types of fertilizer. For nitrogen and phosphorus, the US only relies on imports for about 6 and 13% respectively. However, potash, they are very much reliant on imports. The key point with this, however, is that 80 to 90% of those imports come from Canada. And so, because the US and Canada have such a stable relationship, uh, even though there is that exposure to imports for this critical component of fertilizers, because it is so tightly tied to an ally, that impact again is really very much diminished and not a vulnerability point for the US. Where the US may find some vulnerability in its food and agriculture production, which is critical for having a stable economy, would potentially be labor. There's less people joining that line of work. There's an aging population in that line of work. And then the supply of labor is now also heavily in question. And so that's a constraint that could potentially shape some of those prices and availability of things moving forward. And all of this kind of goes back to this idea of recalibration in terms of how the US is handling that economy. And much of that recalibration has to do with figuring out what those constraints are and responding to those constraints. The other way we can think about constraints is also with international conflict. And I know a lot of people here are probably paying close attention to the Iran war. We'll say war because there's a lot of military action at this point, with all of the military strikes by the US and Iran on different targets. This example is the one I chose because it is one of the more complex examples. And it's also one that actually is probably going to have more of an impact on the US than some of the other conflicts that are going on in the world right now. If you look at this, you can kind of see how in the news you hear, okay, the US and Iran are trying to strike a deal, and it's a two-party deal. And, sometimes it looks like they're going to have one, and then they decide they're not going to. And then all of a sudden the fighting resumes, and we just kind of seem to be stuck in this, cycle that goes round and round. At some point, there will be a deal. However, this picture is meant to help illustrate the different constraints that both sides kind of face when they're trying to strike a deal. Because for both Iran and the US, these talks are not about their bilateral relationship. It is about their relationship with Israel. It is about their relationship with other Gulf states and also Iraq. And so Iran has an interest in making sure it can have good ties with other neighbors in the region. Israel and Iran are pretty strong mortal enemies for many, many decades now and have no interest in getting along. And so there was a big fear in both Israel and to a lesser extent in some of these Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, where if the US and Iran start to get along, what does that mean for our relationship? Are we going to be secondary to the US relationship with Iran? And then what does that mean for us? Are we going to start seeing some changes in terms of how the US treats us? Are we going to see some security matters open up where now we have to be concerned because the US isn't automatically going to be on our side? And that's a lot of the conversation that's going on. And now, mind you, too, you also have all of the Gulf states in Iraq that have to kind of work amongst themselves with the GCC. They sometimes act in unison, but you also have all of these individual states that you can equally spread out and have your own relationship map with. And so things get very complicated, especially when you look at the US military bases and interests in the Middle East, as well as Iran and where their proxy groups are in the Middle East. And it gets very convoluted very quickly. And all of these different countries and all of their national interests and all of their relationships with the US act as a constraint when negotiating occurs between the United States and Iran. And so I think that's important to keep in mind because it's never about just the US and Iran. It's about all of these people. And then if you were to expand, you can go into other places of the world and include countries like Turkey or groups of countries like the EU. And it really starts to see when you have that many players why it's hard to get to a deal, why the different pieces each kind of pull back and constrain what a country can agree to, and also why the details are going to matter so much when any type of resolution of this comes into play. Because there's a big detail, as we saw with the fertilizer example, do you rely on China for all of your critical minerals and processing, or do you rely on Canada for your fertilizers? And in those cases, who that country is that you are reliant on makes a very big difference in terms of how you shape your industry and what you decide to prioritize. The US is not prioritizing any type of potash production, but the US is prioritizing a lot of its critical mineral processing and recycling and trying to kind of bring their own sources online without having to rely on China for such matters. And that kind of gets us to, there's other conflicts out there like China, the US, and Japan with the trade relationship, Ukraine, Russia, NATO. Again, all of these conflicts are not just about the US with Russia or the US with China, but all of these other countries that are going together in these different shapes of national interests and things that are going on globally. So it's important to remember just because when you see the United States acting a particular way, oftentimes you look closely enough at what's not being done, and you might be able to then identify some of those constraints of what's going on. And I don't have a good slide for this right now, but I think the critical mineral space is another example where you can see constraints on the United States and how that has shaping behavior in terms of dependency on another country, regulatory barriers potentially at home to trying to take some of these processes back home, vulnerabilities and not necessarily having all of the natural deposits that you would want to meet your needs there. And then who are you going to partner with to help fill some of those gaps? So that's another kind of up and coming space that I'm sure some investors and whatnot are looking at that will definitely be governed both by what countries need and then also by their constraints and what actions are they going to take to overcome those constraints so that they can meet their needs. In the case of something like critical minerals, how are we going to process materials without being vulnerable to China or access materials without being vulnerable to China? So those are some examples of how to think about constraints with country behavior and how they might shape country behavior in different types of markets. that are going on nowadays. And I think we're about 5 minutes out to the end of our time here. So I just want to take a minute to thank everybody for joining us. I know you have a lot of different ways you can spend your afternoons, especially if it's close to your lunch hour. And so thank you for joining us. And I'm here for any questions if there might be any. I don't know if there are.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Alison. Wonderful presentation. I don't have any questions in the chat right now. I do have a comment from one of our viewers,
Mhm.
Tony, just saying it's a very interesting presentation and he learned a lot. He appreciates that you came on today. But like you said, we do have a couple of minutes left here. While we wait to see if anyone does type anything new in the chat in terms of questions, go ahead and do that now if you do have anything to ask Alison. Alison, is there anything that maybe you didn't cover that you didn't think you'd have time for today, or just a frequently asked question that you tend to receive when you do these types of presentations?
Yeah, so I would just say I'm going to go with some stuff in Latin America, just because I think that it is a region that right before the Iran strikes was hot and heavy in terms of the US focus. And at some point, the US needs to pivot back to Latin America and resume that focus, primarily with the future of Cuba. Uh, there's still work being done on the reconstruction of Venezuela, but that has yet to take the front and center of US policy and work right now. But I think it's important not to forget what happened a few months ago when they took Maduro out of the country. All of the threats about how Cuba is next, that hasn't disappeared. It has been put on the back burner, but it has not disappeared. And then also the relationship with countries like Mexico, in particular, because the USMCA negotiations are kicking off again. The automatic renewal is not going to take place. And so we're going to see, again, some more recalibration with the US, Canada, and Mexico in that relationship. I would say, just as a broad picture view, like the US has to do trade with Canada, the US has to do trade with Mexico. So we're not going to see an end to that. But again, it's this idea of recalibrating what that trade looks like. And I would also just try to remind folks that even before NAFTA and even before or the USMCA, however you want to call it, the US had bilateral treaties with Mexico and Canada. And those treaties are technically still in place. So even if worst case scenario, you see the end of the USMCA as we know it right now, or a strange evolution, kind of like NAFTA to USMCA to something else, do realize that trade will not stop. Trade will never stop between these countries. There's already infrastructure in place that if the USMCA disappeared, trade would still be able to continue from a regulatory perspective. It would still need some tweaking in shapes. And again, this also goes back to the idea of the devil is always in the details when it comes to geopolitics and markets, because what sectors will be impacted and what industries would definitely, be different depending. So like automotives is always going to be a red flag for the US and for Mexico, whereas other things may not be quite so problematic.
Well, Alison, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Once again, brilliant presentation. I know that our audience appreciated all of the information that you shared with us today. And to those of you who did tune in live, thank you as well for joining us. And be sure to stay tuned as we do have a lot more in store for you in this Money Show Virtual Expo. And yes, Alison, it's been a pleasure having you on. I look forward to next time.
Likewise, thank you.
Absolutely. Now, to those of you watching live, again, be sure to stay tuned. We have a lot more in store for you today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.